The changing of or shifting of a demand curve is one of the most important concepts in economics. In this video, you will learn to solve demand curve shift problems. In this video, you will learn the procedure for doing demand shift problems, the variables that cause demand curves to shift, how to determine the shift of a demand curve, to apply the procedure for doing demand shift problems to a typical demand curve shift problem. The procedure for a demand shift problem is use the supply and demand graphs to analyze the problem available on Blackboard or the CD passed out in class. Decide whether the problem is related to a shift in the demand curve or a shift in the supply curve. If the problem is about a shift in the demand curve, decide whether the shift is to the right or to the left. If you decide that the demand curve is shifting to the left, draw a line to the left of the demand curve. If you decide that the demand curve has shifted to the right, draw a line to the right of the demand curve. 6. You'll need to draw a line from the new equilibrium point to the price axis. 7. You'll need to draw a line from the new equilibrium point to the quantity axis. Decide whether the equilibrium price has increased or decreased. Finally, decide whether the equilibrium quantity has increased or decreased. The following things cause the demand curve to shift: changes in people's income, prices of related goods, changes in tastes and preferences, changes in the number of buyers, changes in the exchange rate. Here's a table that summarizes the impact of different variables on the demand curve. You might want to pause the video to view or to copy down the table. A copy of the table may be also found on Blackboard under Lecture 3. This is the second part of the table that summarizes the things that impact the demand curve. You might want to pause the video once again or to view or to copy down the table. A copy of the table may be found on Blackboard under Lecture 3. The things that cause the demand curve to shift are income. Notice that in income there are two types of goods that have different effects when income increases. Remember that normal goods are goods whose demand curves shift to the right as income increases, and inferior goods are goods whose demand curves shift to the left when income increases. Prices of substitutes, prices of complement goods, increases or decreases in population, and finally the exchange rate. The exchange rate is how much it costs to buy a foreign currency. The word appreciate means that one currency is able to purchase more of another currency. The word depreciate means that one currency is able to purchase a lesser amount of another currency. The middle column tells us how the variable in the first column changes. For example, if the problem says that incomes have increased, we need to find income in the variable column and then move to the middle column, change in variable, to find the word increase. The variables that deal with exchange rate, notice the word increases and decreases are replaced with the word appreciates and depreciates. Remember that the term exchange rate means how much it costs to buy a foreign currency. Also remember that the word appreciates means that one currency is able to purchase more of another currency, and the word depreciates means that one currency is able to purchase a lesser amount of another currency. The third column tells us what happens to the demand curve as a result of the change. Let's look at an example of reading the columns. Generally, factory workers buy name brand potato chips. The price of name brand potato chips changes from $3 a bag to $6 a bag. What happens to the demand for store brand potato chips? The first two entries deal with income and the demand for a normal good. Since the problem says nothing about the income of an individual purchasing the potato chips, these entries are not relevant to the problem. The second set of entries also deal with income but for an inferior good. Since the problem says nothing about the income of the individuals purchasing the potato chips, these entries are not relevant to the problem. The third column deals with prices of a good. In this case, we'll need to look over to the third column to see if we are dealing with a substitute or complement. Since the problem asks about the impact of a price increase of name brand potato chips on store brand potato chips, which are close substitutes, we will focus on the two rows that deal with substitutes. Since the name brand potato chips have increased, we select the increases box looking for the change in variable. The last column tells us that individuals will demand more of the store brand potato chips, that is the substitute, causing the demand curve for the substitute or the store brand potato chips to shift to the right. Now let's look at working through a demand problem in its entirety. The problem is there's a downturn in the economy and factory workers are laid off from their jobs. What happens to the demand for tickets to local sporting events? The first step is to either draw the diagram on the right part of the slide on a piece of paper or use some of the diagrams available on Blackboard on the CD which you received in class. The first step is to determine the problem is a demand shift or not. The answer is yes, because the demand shift problems, because the problems involves consumers, the workers, and their income. And finally, the word demand appears in the problem. Next, we need to decide which direction the demand curve will shift in response to workers' income. Before looking at the table for figuring out which way the demand curve will shift, we need to decide whether tickets to sporting events are normal goods or inferior goods. The definition of a normal good is when an individual income increases, the demand for the good increases, and an individual's income decreases, the demand for the good decreases. The definition of an inferior good is when an individual's income increases and the demand for the good decreases, and when an individual's income decreases, the demand for the good increases. Tickets to the sporting events are normal goods because generally individuals will buy less of them as their income decreases. Next, we need to look at our table to help us decide what happens to the demand curve. Since the factory workers are laid off, the incomes of the workers will decline, so we need to look at the income entries of the table. Since tickets to sporting events are normal goods, the last two entries are not relevant because they deal with inferior goods. Next question is, has the income of the labor off workers increased as a result of being laid off from the factory? The answer is emphatically no. Has the income of the workers decreased as a result of being laid off from the factory? Yes. So we're going to choose the second option, income, normal good, decrease. Since the income of the workers has decreased and sporting events are normal goods, we will conclude that the demand curve will shift to the left by reading over to the shift direction column. Since tickets to local sporting goods are normal goods, and since the demand curve shifts left, you will need to draw a line to the left of the original demand curve. Notice that a new equilibrium point E1 is created. Next, draw a line from the new equilibrium point to the price axis and label the new price P1. Next, draw a line to the new equilibrium point to the quantity axis and label the new price Q1. Since P1 is lower than P2 on the price axis, the equilibrium price of the good has decreased. Since Q1 is to the left of Q0 on the quantity axis, the equilibrium quantity has decreased. The answer to the problem is that the demand curve shifts to the left, causing the equilibrium price to decrease and the quantity equilibrium to decrease. In this video, you learned the procedure for doing demand curve problems. You learned the variables that cause demand curves to shift, how to determine the direction of a shift of a demand curve, and finally how to apply the procedure for doing a demand shift problems to a typical demand curve shift problem.